Part 1 of Chapter 20, News from Distant Friends. It was the month of May. From every height the full, fresh streams of spring were flowing down into the valley. The clear, warm sunshine lay upon the mountain, which had turned green again. The last snows had disappeared, and the sun had already coaxed many of the flowers to show their bright heads above the grass. Up above, the gay young wind of spring was singing through the fir trees and shaking down the old dark needles to make room for the new bright green ones that were soon to deck out the trees in their spring finery. Higher up still, the great bird went circling round in the blue ether as of old, while the golden sunshine lit up the grandfather's hut, and all the ground about it was warm and dry again, so that one might sit out where one liked. Heidi was at home again on the mountain, running backwards and forwards in her accustomed way, not knowing which spot was most beautiful. Now she stood still to listen to the deep, mysterious voice of the wind as it blew down to her from the mountain summits, coming nearer and gathering strength as it came, till it broke with force against the fir trees, bending and shaking them and seeming to shout for joy, so that she too, though blown about like a feather, felt she must join in the chorus of exulting sounds. Then she would run round again to the sunny space in front of the hut, and seating herself on the ground would peer closely into the short grass to see how many little flower cups were open or thinking of opening. She rejoiced with all the myriad little beetles and winged insects that jumped and crawled and danced in the sun, and drew in deep draughts of the spring scents that rose from the newly awakened earth, and thought the mountain was more beautiful than ever. All the tiny living creatures must be as happy as she, for it seemed to her there were little voices all round her singing and humming in joyful tunes. Oh, the mountain! Oh, the mountain! From the shed at the back came the sound of sawing and chopping, and Heidi listened to it with pleasure, for it was the old familiar sound she had known from the beginning of her life up here. Suddenly she jumped up and ran round, for she must know what her grandfather was doing. In front of the shed door already stood a finished new chair, and a second was in course of construction under the grandfather's skillful hand. "Oh, I know what these are for!" exclaimed Heidi in great glee. "We shall want them when they all come from Frankfurt. This one is for Grandmama, and the one you are now making is for Clara, and then there will, I suppose, have to be another," continued Heidi with more hesitation in her voice. "Or do you think, Grandfather, that perhaps Fräulein Rottenmeier will not come with them?" "Well, I cannot say just yet," said her grandfather, "but it will be safer to make one so that we can offer her a seat if she does." Heidi looked thoughtfully at the plain wooden chair without arms, as if trying to imagine how Fräulein Rottenmeier and a chair of this sort would suit one another. After a few minutes' contemplation, "Grandfather," she said, shaking her head doubtfully, "I don't think she would be able to sit on that." "Then we will invite her on the couch with the beautiful green turf feather bed," was her grandfather's quiet rejoinder. While Heidi was pausing to consider what this might be, there approached from above a whistling, calling, and other sounds which Heidi immediately recognized. She ran out and found herself surrounded by her four-footed friends. They were apparently as pleased as she was to be among the heights again, for they leaped about and bleated for joy, pushing Heidi this way and that, each anxious to express his delight with some sign of affection. But Peter sent them flying to right and left, for he had something to give Heidi. When he at last got up to her, he handed her a letter. "There," he exclaimed, leaving the further explanation of the matter to Heidi herself. "Did someone give you this while you were out with the goats?" she asked in her surprise. "No," was the answer. "Where did you get it from then?" "I found it in the dinner bag." Which was true to a certain extent. The letter to Heidi had been given him the evening before by the postman at Dorfli, and Peter had put it in his empty bag. That morning he had stuffed his bread and cheese on top of it, and had forgotten it when he fetched Almunkel's 2 goats. Only when he had finished his bread and cheese at midday, and was searching in the bag for any last crumbs, did he remember the letter which lay at the bottom. Heidi read the address carefully. Then she ran back to the shed, holding out her letter to her grandfather in high glee. "From Frankfurt! From Clara! Would you like to hear it?" The grandfather was ready and pleased to do so, as also Peter, who had followed Heidi into the shed. He leant his back against the doorpost, as he felt he could follow Heidi's reading better if firmly supported from behind, and so stood prepared to listen. "Dearest Heidi, everything is packed, and we shall start now in 2 or 3 days, as soon as Papa himself is ready to leave. He is not coming with us, as he has first to go to Paris. The doctor comes every day, and as soon as he is inside the door, he cries, 'Off now as quickly as you can, off to the mountain.' He is most impatient about our going. You cannot think how much he enjoyed himself when he was with you. He has called nearly every day this winter, and each time he has come into my room and said he must tell me about everything again. And then he sits down and describes all he did with you and the grandfather, and talks of the mountains and the flowers, and of the great silence up there far above all towns and villages, and of the fresh, delicious air, and often adds, 'No one can help getting well up there.' He himself is quite a different man since his last visit, and looks quite young again and happy, which he had not been for a long time before. Oh, how I am looking forward to seeing everything, and to being with you on the mountain, and to making the acquaintance of Peter and the goats. I shall have first to go through a 6 weeks' cure at Regat's. This the doctor has ordered, and then we shall move up to Dorfli, and every fine day I shall be carried up the mountain in my chair and spend the day with you. Grandmama is traveling with me and will remain with me. She also is delighted at the thought of paying you a visit. But just imagine, Fräulein Rottenmeier refuses to come with us. Almost every day Grandmama says to her, 'Well, how about this Swiss journey, my worthy Rottenmeier? Pray say if you would really like to come with us.' But she always thanks Grandmama very politely and says she has quite made up her mind. I think I know what has done it. Sebastian gave such a frightful description of the mountain, of how the rocks were so overhanging and dangerous that at any minute you might fall into a crevasse, and how it was such steep climbing that you feared at every step to go slipping to the bottom, and that goats alone could make their way up without fear of being killed. She shuddered when she heard him tell of all this, and since then she has not been so enthusiastic about Switzerland as she was before. Fear has also taken possession of Tinette, and she also refuses to come. So Grandmama and I will be alone. Sebastian will go with us as far as Regat's, and then return here. I can hardly bear waiting till I see you again. Goodbye, dearest Heidi. Grandmama sends you her best love and all good wishes. Your affectionate friend, Clara." Peter, as soon as the conclusion of the letter had been reached, left his reclining position and rushed out, twirling his stick in the air in such a reckless fashion that the frightened goats fled down the mountain before him with higher and wider leaps than usual. Peter followed at full speed, his stick still raised in air in a menacing manner, as if he was longing to vent his fury on some invisible foe. This foe was indeed the prospect of the arrival of the Frankfurt visitors, the thought of whom filled him with exasperation. Heidi was so full of joyful anticipation that she determined to seize the first possible moment next day to go down and tell Grandmother who was coming, and also particularly who was not coming. These details would be of great interest to her, for Grandmother knew well all the persons named from Heidi's description, and had entered with deep sympathy into all that the child had told her of her life and surroundings in Frankfurt. Heidi paid her a visit in the early afternoon, for she could now go alone again. The sun was bright in the heavens, and the days were growing longer, and it was delightful to go racing down the mountain over the dry ground, with the brisk May wind blowing from behind, and speeding Heidi on her way a little more quickly than her legs alone would have carried her. The grandmother was no longer confined to her bed. She was back in her corner at her spinning wheel, but there was an expression on her face of mournful anxiety. Peter had come in the evening before, brimful of anger, and had told about the large party who were coming up from Frankfurt, and he did not know what other things might happen after that, and the old woman had not slept at all. Pursued by the old thought of Heidi being taken from them, being taken from her, Heidi ran in and, taking her little stool, immediately sat down by grandmother and began eagerly pouring out all her news, growing more excited with her pleasure as she went on. But all of a sudden she stopped short and said anxiously, "What is the matter, grandmother? Aren't you a bit pleased with what I am telling you?" "Oh, yes, yes, of course, child, since it gives you so much pleasure," she answered, trying to look more cheerful. "But I can see all the same that something troubles you. Is it because you think, after all, that Fräulein Rottenmeier may come?" asked Heidi, beginning to feel anxious herself. "No, no, no, it is nothing, child," said the grandmother, wishing to reassure her. "Just give me your hand that I may feel sure you are here. No doubt it would be the best thing for you, although I feel I could scarcely survive it." "Oh, I do not want anything of the best if you could scarcely survive it," said Heidi in such a determined tone of voice that the grandmother's fears increased, as she felt sure the people from Frankfurt were coming to take Heidi back with them. Since now she was well again, they naturally wished to have her with them once more. But she was anxious to hide her trouble from Heidi if possible, as the latter was so sympathetic that she might refuse, perhaps, to go away. And that would not be right. She sought for help, but not for long, for she knew of only one. Heidi found the place at once and read out in her clear young voice, "All things will work for good to those who trust in me. I come with healing on my wings to save and set free." "Yes, yes, that is exactly what I wanted to hear," said the grandmother, and the deep expression of trouble passed from her face. Heidi looked at her thoughtfully for a minute or two and then said, Healing means that which cures everything and makes everybody well. Doesn't it, grandmother?" "Well, yes, that is it," replied the old woman with a nod of assent, "and we may be sure everything will come to pass according to God's good purpose." "Read the verse again, that we may remember it well and not forget it again." And Heidi read the words over 2 or 3 times, for she also had pleasure in this assurance of all things being arranged for the best. When the evening came, Heidi returned home upon the mountain. The stars came out overhead one by one, so being bright and sparkling that each seemed to send a fresh ray of joy into your heart. She was obliged to call continually to look up, and as the whole sky at last grew spangled with them, she spoke aloud. "Yes, I understand now why we feel so happy and are not afraid about anything, because God knows that what is good and beautiful for us." And the stars, with their glistening eyes, continued to nod to her till she reached home, where she found her grandfather also standing and looking up at them, for they had seldom been more glorious than they were this night. All right, we'll finish that chapter tomorrow. See you then.